Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our West Africa Real Estate in the African Context webinar. This is our 9th webinar in our COVID-19 Impact on African Real Estate series. On Tuesday, we focused on the SADC region, and today we'll be taking a deep dive on West Africa with a specific focus on Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Senegal. We are very fortunate to have an excellent panel with us here today with representation from across the region. I would now like to introduce the panel. So moderating and setting the scene for today is Tola Akinhami, Head Real Estate Finance West Africa, Stanbic IBTC Capital. And our panelists for today, Ivan Cornett, Managing Partner Latitude 5, Ifeoma Ezekofar, Principal Investment Officer IFC, Hakeem Ogniron, Founder Chief Executive Officer Eximia Realty Home for Me, and David Lashbrook, Director, Momentum African Real Estate. Thank you all for your time today and for providing your insights. I would also like to take this time to thank our headline sponsor, Standard Bank, and our series sponsor, Nedbank, for allowing us to make these sessions happen. For our audience, we once again thank you for participating and tuning in. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the session. We'll try get to as many as possible throughout the allotted time frame. And we also encourage you to participate in the polls. I would now like to hand over to Tola, who will be starting off with a presentation and then going into the moderation of the session. Thank you and enjoy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Kev, for the introduction. Just to set the theme for what the discussion for this afternoon is looking at real estate from a West African context and linking it to the current pandemic and looking at and trying to chart a path to recovery and seeing the impact across the market and taking steps to evolve the asset class. I'm joined by 4 other speakers, and we'll basically be going through various themes and would welcome questions as well. So just to kick off, we'll be having a very quick 10-15 minute synopsis of the West African real estate market and some of the impact that we're going to see, and that will set the scene and for this discussion framework. So in terms of what we'll be looking to cover under the next 10-15 minutes of presentation is essentially setting some macro background to the leading economies within the West African region, which really it's mapped out in the shape that we see here. So we've got Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Senegal. So those will be the focus theme. On the back of that is then really a deep dive into what we're seeing from a COVID context. And the reality is that, what really is the case is that whilst the impact of COVID is wide and varied, what we're seeing is that the impact varies from region to region. So when I say region, I'm talking about Africa as a whole, and you're looking at East Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, and it differs across the various regions. It differs across countries, and it differs across asset classes. I think that's an important point to stress. And going further to that is then, what's the impact on the various, investors, developers, capital flows, what we're seeing, what are the emerging themes. And wrapping that up will then be the discussion framework around what the recovery part would be, time frame, tenures, what finances have to do, what investors have to do, what owners of assets have to do in terms of building resilience in existing assets and also future-proofing new developments. So broadly, I think I've touched on some of the key themes there. There have been a couple of webinar series that has touched on various regions. Yesterday, or no, earlier on this week, there was a discussion around the impact on the SADC region. There have been a focus as well on East Africa, and yes, this presentation or this webinar series then focus on seeing the impact as it impacts West Africa. Central Bank is uniquely positioned given that we've got teams spread across the various sub-Saharan African continents and exposed to a diversity of asset classes. Right. So just looking at the core pillars, or should I say, the leading economies within the region, I think the background and the backdrop is really themed on, what the indices are. And from a macro point of view, we what really tracks and what the investors focus on is, population, GDP, and growth in GDP. I'm proud to the current prices that we're facing. They were really positive indices, with Nigeria having a positive GDP growth of 2.3% on the back of 2-3 year 2016, where it was in the recession. Similarly, Ghana has also, from a good GDP point of view, is forecasted to be doing well, and some of the numbers that we've seen prior to the pandemic are historically, very competitive within the emerging market segment, and Francophone regions such as Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal, which is beginning to emerge, are not left out with kind of GDP numbers that one is seeing. So those were the things that we started the year with, and the COVID impact has kind of readdressed that. Statistics from the IMF, from Fitch Ratings, portend, and we'll see that in subsequent slides. So while the impact is seen in the current year, the forecast is still there post the pandemic. There's meant to be expected growth seen within the region, and we'll touch on that, and you see it from the charts later on. So, what are we seeing in terms of the COVID impact? I think in the broad sense, what I said early on at the intro was the impact is seen across various markets. West Africa is not unique. What we're dealing with is a global issue, and but the responses differs from region to region. That is clear. So if one looks at Africa, there are regions, and West Africa is one. There are also different countries, and they've had different measures in terms of the lockdown measures, the impact on the impact on people being able to go to work, the impact of consumers being able to shop as they would like to, and this then cuts across the various asset classes. What we've tried to show here, and if you can see it, it's really just touching on some of the key pointers across office space, across the residential space, across the retail space, and the red boxes just essentially trying to show a bit of a negative downside, and whereas the green is showing some of the uptick that we may then see from the positive indices across those segments. So if I use an example of the office space, that in the near term, currently there are no direct impact, given the fact that the sector is slightly resilient as compared to retail, where we've seen more of the stress has been the hospitality and retail directly, even the impact of shops not being able to trade, of tenants not being able to trade. But some of the measures have then been used across various markets at various times, and we're beginning to see shops begin to open up. It's different for a bit more sticky, and rentals being paid upfront. Depending on how long the pandemic exists for, one will then be able to see and take a more different view on what may happen. The next slide also still touches on some of the impact that has been seen, and diversity in terms of traditionally where have the investors focused on, and where are the new themes that we may see. There's a lot of talk about healthcare being one of the winners that may emerge. So there is that. There's data center, as well. There's also, as well, the industrial opportunities that may line up given logistic challenges and the need to create a diverse economic base from that point of view. I think one other area that we may then begin to see, and which could really then act as a stimulus to economic growth, is then what happens within housing, because some of the social distancing, some of the issues that are emerging, could be a catalyst for government being able to stimulate the economy, and really doing a lot to ensure that asset class begins to see the kind of growth that all traditional assets may have seen. So moving forward, I'm being wary of time as well. Some of the macro stats which I've touched on, and I would move. And I think on this slide, I think the key thing is to focus on the GDP growth. It's because real estate as an asset class mirrors the economy. So if we begin to see an uptick in the economy, real estate follows suit. It has a lagging effect. So, and I think from a broad-based spectrum, it's clear to see that we will see growth post the pandemic. Because of the stimulus of the new investment to resolve some of the teething issues that this might have resulted in. Some of the supply gap issues will begin to be fixed, and really from the fact that if this is a 3 to 6 months scenario, then 2020 will be really a low base, and then the resilience in asset classes would then mean that you'll see an upward trend. I think other key areas to focus on is interest rate, and the interest rate that's been shown here is more of local currency interest rates. Unemployment is a key data point. Exchange rate too is a key data point, given how real estate is being financed within the region. So broadly, we've talked about stimulus packages, and I think the key point to stress in this section is really the fact that yes, government in the various markets are providing the necessary support to ride the curve. We're seeing the various central banks also creating and trying to stimulate the sectors and stimulate the economy and trying to stimulate certain sectors, agricultural, healthcare, to drive growth in the economy. I think a key point is also from an external results point of view and the ability of the various countries to assess, unique interventions from the likes of the IMF, the World Bank. Recently, Ghana secured a $1 billion IMF loan in April. Nigeria did likewise and is looking to also get funding from the World Bank and the AFDB as well. So, what is happening next? I think it's important. What this slide really is looking at and trying to depict is, what the story has been in the last 10 years. So it's been a steady part of asset creation, stabilization and consolidation activities that we've seen within the West African market, with about an estimated $4 billion of private capital being invested, across various asset classes within the region, and it's come from various markets. South Africa being an important capital base within the African continent. United States, from the US, from Europe, from Middle East, so, and of course across different investor groups. The pensions from the sovereign wealth funds, asset managers, private equity funds. So what will be the theme in the next 5 to 10 years? That's really the question. Where will be the capital coming from? Where will be the asset classes that this will be focusing on? I think those are the key themes. And from how we're seeing it, there will be winners, there will be differentiation in terms of the capital structure, in terms of the forms of capital, and the capital stack, because it's important, in terms of how that is structured, and the extent that is built into the various asset classes, and also really understanding, what is the requirement, what is the need, and the second step, we talk to consumer and psychology. So in terms of the retail space, what do the consumers really need in terms of the office space? What will be the emerging theme, given the discussion around working from home, given flexible schedule that we begin to see. There's another school of thought that says, given the challenges within the African continent, the infrastructure, the technology infrastructural gap, that it's not a one size fits all. So what will be a theme, or what would be the new normal in a market such as in Europe would differ for Africa, and especially for West Africa. So it's important that whatever is being done, we're really focused on our continent, being quite detailed in terms of and being granular in terms of where the issues are, where the demand is, and trying to really mirror access to fit into that box. I've talked about that briefly. I've talked about, and I think the important thing to show on this slide is then, in terms of the growth prospects, the rate listings that may then happen, different asset classes that may then emerge, forms of capital that may also then emerge. I think those are the emerging themes and points to really then start to think about. And I think, just to set the scene for the discussion that would happen, this slide really then just seeks to speak to to what I've just addressed. So if we think about, what are the support framework, what are the stimulus packages, both from a private sector point of view and also from a government point of view, what are the global best practices that can be adopted within an African context? I think that is key. That's relevant. Understanding as well the market dynamics, and really adjusting to a new form of normal in terms of where demand and supply is, and that speaks to values, rentals, valuations, and whatnot. And really then morphing and trying to fit that into what is then sustainable for existing assets, as well as how do we then accommodate, how do we begin to develop resilience in terms of future assets that will be created as well. And that then speaks to the critical element that brings it all together: financing, portfolio concentrations, refinancing, acquisition activities that would see, given some of the things that are emerging in the market. I think on that note, I think I've spoken for longer than I planned, but I think on that note, I would welcome the rest of the panelists, and we'll then begin to speak a bit more deeply around some of this, and we'll welcome questions as well from the audience. Thank you very much for listening. All right, I think we're waiting for them. All right, thank you. Can everyone hear me? All right, good. All right. So I think, I think it's important to really get perspective, from each person, just really in like a minute or two, what impact we're seeing across our various businesses, our various regions. What is the general thing that has been seen in terms of how we started Q1 and how the year is shaping up. And I think, David, it would be interesting to hear from your side, given the investments you've had in Ghana and the outlook you have, investments you look to do in Nigeria and the West African region. What are you seeing generally, please?
Pipeline's definitely slowed down in terms of projects. And, one of the big challenges as a real estate investor, you want to get out there and see the land. It's a touchy-feely thing. And at the moment, we can't even get there. So that has been one challenge, deeds offices closing and being a slowdown. But activity hasn't stopped by any means. We are currently working very hard on a couple of projects in Nigeria and one in Ghana and elsewhere in Africa. So things are still going. I think that there is still definitely a demand for quality space from quality tenants. It has slowed, but it is still there. So we are still finding things to do for sure.
All right. Thank you very much for that, David. I think it would be interesting to get some perspective from Ivan, given that you are covering more of the Francophone country, Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal. So what do you see in terms of the impact of COVID in that region?
Yeah, thank you, Tola. Thank you, Kafir, for having me. First, I would like also to thank API Events for organizing this series of webinar. I think it is more relevant than ever to stay connected and share our common knowledge in these challenging times. To respond to your question, Tola, to date, as you know, Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire, the main economies of Francophone West Africa, have each reported about 2,500 cases and about 30 victims of COVID-19. I'm not going to debate here the numbers, but there are valid arguments to challenge the accuracy. Both countries have been in a state of emergency for more than 2 months and borders closed. Sanitary measures have eased over the last couple of weeks. They include social distancing, wearing masks in public transport, curfews, but the full confinement measures, such as in Europe, Morocco, or South Africa, were never really adopted. As for most African countries with a large informal sector and no social safety nets, governments gave priority to the support of local economy, in particular SMEs and the informal sector. So, as you mentioned in your introduction, we've seen a massive injection of funds, which has been provided by international donors over the last few weeks, including the IMF. The European Union has granted, as recently as Tuesday, 100 million euros to Cote d'Ivoire to fight the pandemic. And as you've seen in the press, discussion is also ongoing for debt relief. On the real estate side, with the assistance of local contractors, hospitals have been urgently built up to beef up the healthcare capacity in capital and secondary cities, and other more permanent healthcare units are in the pipeline in Cote d'Ivoire for 150 million euros. They are going to be built and equipped by American firm Agentis, and Deutsche Bank was mandated as financial arranger earlier this week.
All right, great. Thanks for that. Quite detailed feedback. I think some of what you've described. It's similar to what we've seen in the other countries, being Nigeria, Ghana. But I think Francophone West Africa, it's new and emerging. Just on the follow-on on what you've just described. Are you seeing increased or new interest still emerging from investors within that market? Because I know from sometime last year, there's been quite a lot of attention and focus on Francophone being. And so, are you seeing, or do you think there will be a slowdown given the impact of COVID?
Ivan, you need to switch on your audio.
I'm sorry about that. Sorry. So what I was saying is that 2020 was already a landmark year for the Côte d'Ivoire economy across all sectors. A presidential election is currently scheduled for the end of October this year, and these are challenging times for a country, considering that there's never been really a peaceful transition of regime since the independence in 1960s. So even before COVID, many aspects of the economy had slowed down and waited for early 2021 to fully resume the activities. We have seen this last month some pressure on rentals because of this election, and suggestion to postpone the election by up to 6 months because of COVID has been rejected by the government to date. Postponing could potentially increase the tension. So if this is the case, obviously it will be a delay in a possible recovery and a slowdown in interest in the country.
Okay, thanks very much, Ivan. I think format will be useful given the role IFC has played, and I know you have. You cover the sub-Saharan African continent, but I think it will be important to get your perspective in terms of how the IFC is reacting to this pandemic, and especially in the context of real estate asset class. What is the current theme around that, and what can we expect from the IFC? If I can crack a joke, to the extent we're seeing the IMF being able to grant loans to governments, are we going to see a flurry of support loans from the IFC in these times? So just to get what the real theme around how you're really seeing it is. So thank you very much. I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay. IFC has had experience from past shocks, right, including the global financial crisis in 2008. And what this has taught us is that keeping companies solvent is key during a crisis, is key to saving jobs and limiting the economic damage. And speed is of essence at this time, right, and times like this. So as a result, IFC has implemented an 8 billion with B for boy, not million, M for man, fast track financing facility to help companies affected by the outbreak, right? And the idea is to keep solvent companies in business and preserve jobs. And this facility, 8 billion I mentioned, is not for Africa, it's for the world, all the regions we cover, but Africa is a priority for us. And we have some internal percentages we work with showing that we expect a significant amount to go into Africa. And what type of financing is this, you would ask, right? This is more of short-term financing and some financing for the recovery. So we are looking at companies which are facing maybe temporary solvent companies, ordinarily solvent. So this is not about working with already distressed companies, but solvent companies which are facing liquidity and problems. So we try and look for ways to either give them liquidity facilities or give them short-term relief. For example, standstill and suspension on principal and interest payments for example, 6 months to keep the business solvent as they address a temporary liquidity problem. And I keep saying temporary because we hope this is short enough to be temporary. But I wanted to mention something that's very important. At this point, our initial support is to existing clients, right, that have been affected by the outbreak. Maybe over time it will grow beyond that, but they are our top priority right now, as well as to financial institutions, because we cannot reach all the clients very quickly. So we're also looking at extending facilities to banks so that they can support businesses facing the crisis. This is targeted facilities, right, that will give businesses working capital support and medium-term financing, businesses that are struggling with the impact of the pandemic, rather than for business as usual. So, and then one other thing, my last point on this is we are also trying to develop advisory services, our advisory services capacity, so that we can have a broader impact on the private sector during the pandemic. For example, we are working with some of our partners to understand the impact of COVID on certain sectors so that we have better informed solutions, right? For example, in South Africa, we have partnered with the Department of Tourism and the Tourism Business Council to survey the industry to try and find out what targeted advisory services we can provide. And the first 3 surveys which will happen over the next 12 months, will be helping the government and the industry design special support for the sector. Because as you know, the tourism sector is very hard hit.
I mean, thanks. If I might ask, quite some useful feedback on some of the measures IFC is taking there. You mentioned the tourism sector at the last end, and you mentioned companies in the broad frame, in the broad spectrum, but just trying to bite almost, or try to focus on real estate. Is there any specific arrangement for real estate, or will real estate just fit, or will real estate clients, entities then fit within the broad spectrum of companies? Just to understand that better.
Yeah, real estate companies will fit into the broad spectrum, because this is a response to what's happening in the pandemic. And since I cover only real estate, tourism, retail property for sub-Saharan Africa, all I'm saying relates to what I'm doing. But just to mention, my colleagues in manufacturing are getting access to the same facility, and in agribusiness, it's not designed for just tourism, retail property, which I focus on. But I'd like to mention that there are some sectors that seem to be harder hit and are being given more attention. And tourism is one of them that we notice is really, really bad. So that's why I mentioned the tourism example. Of course, the real estate has been hit, but we think tourism at this point looks like the hardest hit, maybe followed by public shopping malls and things like that. Then maybe offices and affordable housing are the last, on the list.
Yeah, I was just going to touch on that point. So I think, I think what I would say is that while we focus on tourism, I think the retail sector within the African context, it's an area that needs to be looked at, given, and we can touch on that subsequently. So start from the others and then begin to trickle down. So thanks very much for that, Mr. Ogunero. I think as we evolve, and I think it would be good to then get your perspective in terms of we've talked about the impact, we've talked about what stimulus, what other arrangements we can start to look at in the current market. But from your own perspective, I mean, what should be the priorities, the focus areas, for players, so be it developers, be it funds, how do, what would you advise people would have to do to navigate the pandemic, and most especially prepare for life after COVID-19?
Okay, thank you very much. Let me also thank API for organizing this event. And Tola, thank you for that, your beautiful introduction. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that for Nigeria, we must understand that the impact is very significant, because we are a mono product economy, and you can see what has happened to the price of oil in the past few weeks. You have also made the point that obviously real estate will thrive off the back of very strong macro fundamentals, And when you have an economy that is largely dependent on one product that has been so badly affected, you can begin to imagine the kind of problems that will arise from that. I also think that, for me, I think it's also a bit early to start talking about the overall impact, because I'm not sure whether we still know where we are on the curve itself. Everything will depend on how quickly we're able to flatten the curve and get back to close to normal lives. The longer this uncertainty persists, the more terrible it will be for real estate, because real estate doesn't thrive in an environment of uncertainty. So that's just for me by way of a general introduction. In terms of what I think should be the key priorities for the players, I think first of all, everybody must recognize that we're in a new normal, and when you're in a new normal, I mean, everything has to be almost totally reset. So, and I think our responses should depend on where we play in the value chain. So if you're a developer, there are key areas that you should focus on now. You have to focus on your pipeline, because clearly with the lockdown, we've seen significant pipeline disruptions. You have to focus on your pipeline. What kind of recovery programs do you need post the pandemic? You have to focus on your supply chain. Many people didn't realize that China is like the supply chain capital of the world. For the Nigerian real estate sector, 70% of our input is imported, and about 30% of that comes from China. So you can begin to imagine the significant disruptions that will emanate from that. So you need to focus on your supply chain and see what you need to do to recreate yourself for the future. I also think it's time to focus on engaging your stakeholders. There's no running away from all the significant negative impact this will have on projects and project deliveries. So if you have customers who have paid off plan, this is the time to engage them. If you have other stakeholders, this is the time to engage them. I think it's also time to deal with the issue of leverage. If you are leveraged, I think this is also the time to begin to engage your lenders. I don't think anybody should wait until after the pandemic to begin to engage lenders. So those are the general issues for me around what should be the priorities for developers. For us, for property managers, clearly with new rules around social interaction, with new rules around social distancing, we also have to begin to look at how we're going to position our asset management to fit that. So one of the things that I have been talking to teams in the past few weeks is that now, as developers, as builders, we have to be a lot more granular in our designs. There are things that used to be like nice to haves, which we now have to infuse into designs, even existing buildings. So things like remote sensors, because a critical element of the new interaction is that you have to minimize touch points in space management. So things like remote sensors, remote control doors, remote faucets in bathrooms and things like that. I think that property managers will do well to reassure their occupants that they are putting all these simple measures in place, to give the confidence in terms of utilizing their properties going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So that's that for me for now.
Yeah, thank you. I think you touched in a very broad spectrum, some of the key themes, in terms of what one needs to do in terms of building the resilience now, trying to survive now, and then, and of course, the following from that is then shaping and restructuring for life post-COVID. And you touched on some of the things that it impacts Nigeria: oil price, devaluation, whatnot. From our own space and where we see it, it's been, people talk of a twin shock. For me, I think it's more than a twin shock. It's almost four. You're talking about oil price, devaluation, COVID, and then a possible recession. But the impact is evolving. Which as we evolve with it, we need to also be proactive in trying to stimulate some of what the reactions would be. So I think, I welcome some of the thoughts that you've just shared there. And just on that link, I think, David, it would be important to get your views in terms of really understanding and seeing, given the markets in which you am involved as a private equity fund, in inflowing dollars and having to earn, local currency, albeit, denominated, leases denominated in USD. What are you seeing from a devaluation, currency pressure, and liquidity issue? Would that, continue to be a key factor in a post-pandemic recovery, and in terms of managing the volatility that brings about? Is that, how would you play, within your asset class, given your investments in Ghana, in Nigeria, how do you look to navigate the volatility that would result in?
Okay, first and foremost, we don't have any retail exposure, so I'm just speaking from the point of view of offices. All of our tenants in West Africa, both current and pipeline, have dollar-based leases, and they're generally happy to do so because the funding is so much cheaper, which makes your rental a lot cheaper. And for them, their currency exposure, rentals generally about 4% of your total turnover. So even if your currency halved in value and your rental doubled, you've only got a 4%, well, I say only, but only a 4% hit to your income statement. Whereas us as a landlord, that would be a 50% hit to our income statement. So tenants are generally more receptive to that. We have had a bit of pushback on requests for currency sharing, but when we explain to the tenants that their susceptibility to FX is much more, is much less than ours, then they generally accept it. And the benefits of dollar funding are clearly there. From a liquidity point of view, we have had challenges, and I think we will see more challenges going forward. Most of our tenants pay us in local currency, and we have had some challenges converting that, occasionally at losses, occasionally with delays. But we have managed to convert everything, and the key thing is to be able to repay the interest on your dollar bank loan. So we have managed to do that, but there have been some challenges, and I think it might get a bit more challenging over the coming months. In terms of managing volatility, the leases everything that's in negotiation at the moment in terms of future projects, we are still looking at dollar-based leases. We are building into our lease agreements more specific wording on the rate at which your tenant pays you, because there is a bit of discrepancy there. Do they use a bank rate? Do they use the Bank of Ghana rate, the buy rate, the sell rate? So we are defining that. So there's less scope because the spreads between these different currencies are wide. So just to protect ourselves, we are building that into our lease agreements. And then we are, in modeling future projects, we are now modeling certainly a line item just for FX, because I think as a landlord, you should expect to have some currency drag from that translation from local back into dollars.
Thanks, David. I'll just add the follow on there. So, I think you've clearly defined how you've dealt it in the past, which is the understanding, given our own experience as well. What I'm trying to also get in the sense, and there's no right or wrong answer. The situation is still evolving. Do you then see, because there's pressures from a funding point of view, both from equity or debt, given some of the mismatch between currency, liquidity, and what is then collected, and how you then service of the obligation or get returns back to investors. Do you see, and it might, do you see a sense where the structure of investment then changes, and albeit looking at generating maybe for a new fund, looking to generate local capital and also local loans? Do you see that being something that would emerge because what that does is just increases the capital pool to the sector? So it's not a replacement, but it's more traditional, and I think it's a thing that should materialize as the sector matures in the various markets.
Yes, I think that could be something that develops, and that would be very attractive to local institutional investors. As your local institutions are increasing with the likes of pension fund regulation and the ability for these institutional investors now to allocate to the real estate asset class, I do think that's a good thing. The challenge is that it's the cost of that local funding. So if you are going to fund it in debt, and local debt, it might be 8-10% higher than funding it in dollars, and that's a cost that's passed straight onto the tenant as rentals. So that's where the challenge comes in. But if we can address that somehow, if those spreads somehow narrow, the difference between local and foreign, yes, I think that could be an exciting prospect. And we're looking at it all the time. And certainly in East Africa, we are seeing more pressure on dollar rentals than we are in West Africa, for sure. And we are definitely scratching our heads about going forward what the future might look like.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, David. I think you touched on a very key point there in interest rates, and that's the real mover. That normalizes between both funding currencies. And I think just on that note, it'd be interesting to get Ivan's perspective from a Francophone point of view. I mean, there's been a bit more resonance given, the currency being backed by the franc, but also with the new currency that's going to evolve. What do you see? Would it be a solution where, firstly, what has been would you say Francophone West Africa has been a bit more resilient given the support framework that you had, and then just looking forward, given the new currency that may emerge, what could be the potential impact, and currency issues. So linking back to the devaluation issues and liquidity, just getting your views from that point of view.
Yes, thank you, Tola. To build on what David just said, I mean, the situation in Francophone Africa is much simpler than what you would get in Ghana or in Nigeria. I mean, if you read the latest report issued by the IMF mid-April for the 2020 expected GDP growth, there are only a few African countries which are expected to grow this year, and these include Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire with about 3%. And if you compare this to the negative GDP growth that you get in Nigeria of 3.4%, you see also the difference. It's due to the currency. The most obvious difference that you get between Francophone Africa and, for example, Nigeria is for Nigeria to have the reliance on oil. And oil is important because it brings hard currency into the country. A continuous depreciation or risk of devaluation, like we could see for the cedis or the Naira, is not, in my opinion, in the short term, an issue for Francophone Africa. As you said, I mean, the CFA franc is pegged at a fixed rate with the euro, and it doesn't change anything with the future ECO. I mean, it's very similar. It's going to be a very similar situation as the CFA francs with the guarantee of the French state. So the CFA francs or the ECO continues to serve as stabilizers to the economy. I would like, and that's to build also on the what has been said by our esteemed representative of the IFC, is that there is one caveat about Senegal. I mean, Senegal has a very strong tourism sector, and especially favored by international tourists. And it accounts for about 10% of GDP and 9% of employment. So with the closure of international borders, of hotels, of resorts, I mean, the impact of COVID-19 should be particularly felt in this country.
Thanks, Ivan. Just driving on that, I do take the point, and you've touched on the previous element, the part that I kind of miss, which maybe if you have a perspective on, will be the with the new currency that is the echo, if we can use that. I mean, just a little talk on your side on what that would then mean for the Francophone countries. I mean, a lot of people might not be aware of that, so if you can just share your perspective.
Sure. So there's been an agreement end of last year between the French state and Alassane Ouattara, the head of state of Côte d'Ivoire, that basically the idea would be to convert the CFA franc into a new currency. This new currency is supposed to be a first step into a more broader ECOWAS common currency, and its name is going to be the ECO. For the moment, first, there is many aspects which has not yet been resolved, especially the fact that Nigeria and Ghana don't seem to be too thrilled to join the ECO as it stands. But what we see is that, as I mentioned, the fundamentals of the ECO is going to be very similar to what we have in the current CFA francs in terms of stability, and the link to the euro. The main difference is that the French state is not going to have so much say in the conduct of the monetary policy of the West African region.
All right, thanks, Evan. That's very, very useful feedback there. I think, just trying to move forward, I'm wary of time. It will be and Ifeoma, I think it's good to hear from your perspective, given you cover a wider region. So people from other continents might also be listening, and you will be able to share, what IFC's views are from their perspective. So, we've talked to the impact, we've talked to some of the currency issues, which are some of the structural issues that we deal with as we finance and develop real estate assets within the region. So the question then is, in terms of the asset class, we've talked about where the impact lies. It would be good to then understand from each, and from your view, where the IFC will be looking at. Is it really from a development point of view, or also commercial? So what are the emerging sectors that would thrive? So I think firstly, are there new emerging sectors, or what? And then second on that point is, how resilient are the existing traditional asset classes? Ifeoma, please. I think your phone is on mute.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. So I think we have some ideas within IFC, and we're open to a different view on what asset classes we think could drive growth, in the coming years, and possibly bring in significant returns. We believe that collective investment vehicles provide an opportunity, like REIT type structures. Of course, there's some questions about the regulation of REITs in most African countries, I guess except South Africa. But if the regulation could be put in place and we have true REITs, that could drive growth. And also investment platforms, sort of collating several similar assets together under a platform, and it being managed by an investment manager, could also drive growth. One of the advantages of this, as you would imagine, is it would allow people to make smaller investments in the real estate sector rather than having to depend on a developer who has all the capital or a huge chunk of capital. Another sector we think has shown some resilience in the COVID, in the commercial property, is the warehousing and logistics asset class. And we think that there would be significant opportunity for growth in that segment, maybe less focus on grade A office buildings and big shopping malls. And we also think this may be partly also driven by the growth of e-commerce. I mean, given the possible new normal where people would explore shopping online a bit more than usual in Africa, because in the West, yes, it's very common. In Africa, it's a growing segment, but warehousing and logistics will support this type of change in behavior, shopping behavior. Another area the last two we also have in mind is that there might be opportunities in affordable housing, not necessarily high returns, maybe growth in the sector with decent returns. But this is if large players can get more involved in affordable housing, because at the moment, this segment is very fragmented. So developers are unable to deliver at the best price. And I'm talking about affordable housing to the middle class. I'm not referring to social housing. And of course, this has to be complemented by an improvement on the demand side, which is the availability of mortgages and affordability of mortgages. That would really help in this segment. So there we see opportunities there. Finally, advisory services. I know this is not an investment point I'm making, but a lot of people just go and say engage in affordable housing without really understanding what has worked maybe in other regions, what does not work, what are the risks and so on, how much do you need to coordinate with government. So I think there'll be an opportunity to have very specialized advisory services to support these sectors to help growth in these sectors, in these asset classes. I think these are the four, I would say: collective investment vehicles, warehousing, affordable housing, and advisory services.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's very, very, very useful. I think, and you're right. As the sector begins to mature and stabilize, you then expect that the assets that have been created, are then packaged into the vehicle and listed as REITs. And yes, I think the key issue has then been the regulations within the various markets. I know Nigeria recently, from a tax point of view, a finance bill came up early this year, which has addressed the tax pass-through issue that either was. I know Ghana is also looking to evolve their REIT legislation, and activities are going on there from a SEC point of view. So yeah, I think that's very important and should be something to then begin to look to enable more liquidity within the asset class, and also as a means of raising capital pool, both locally and offshore. And I think on the back of what you said, affordable housing, I think it would be remiss not to spend some time around that in terms of the developmental impact it begins to have on our economies. And I think it's really for Akeem, given the role he's played in his previous life, and as well as what he's currently doing in terms of housing. So, I think the question would be, what will it take for you, to actively start funding, within that region? What are the interventions needed, both from a private point of view and also from a government point of view? Infrastructure is a key part. I'm going to say several questions in. One, how infrastructure then begins to also stimulate some of the problems within that asset class. And I know what you will be sharing is quite similar to some of the problems that we see, across the African continent. And maybe, and to the point that he former raised, the fact that, formalizing that sector and creating, institutionalizing it has been kind of the gap, the fragmentation of that sector. So just to get your perspective, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Tola. I think there are two things that I just want to say. First of all, of course, I've done a lot of work on REITs, apart from the fact that we floated our REITs in my former life, like we said. I've also done a lot of work all over, So clearly, I agree with you, Former, that creating the right platform for collective investment schemes around that will help to accelerate the growth, clearly formalize, accelerate the growth in that sector. Because one of the things that is lacking in the sector now is transparency. And what a formal REIT regime tries to do is to help create the right platform from data transparency, that helps investors to really see what they are putting their hand into. Let me also mention that, incidentally, there's been a lot of, if we go a bit more granular, there's been a lot of interventions, regulatory, albeit very disparate, beginning from 2017, 2018. The pioneer status legislation, which created very, very significant incentives for the real estate sector, by the largest that we've ever had in this country. So if you create the right sort of vehicles for your projects, there are significant incentives that you could take advantage of. And you have also mentioned the issue of the Finance Act, which has now helped to amend Section 19 of the CITA, of the Companies Income Tax Act. And that has helped to create the right framework for creating REITs as a proper, transparent, pass-through vehicle. So my sense is that when all these things blow away, people are going to be able to sit down again to look at the possibility of creating that sort of investment vehicles. Now, I think the way I see Nigeria, a whole lot of things are happening, and I think the difference in the response of government this time and to other times is that you can see concerted efforts by government. You can see plans being initiated to execute a lot of the strategies which have been on plan. So if you have followed what has happened in the past 4 weeks, you've seen what is happening with CBN. CBN now trying to finally implement the mortgage interest drawback scheme. Now trying to to give life to the Nigerian Mortgage Guarantee Company. You can see the NMRC and now working with Federal Mortgage Bank, working with PENCOM, because I think, like Ifema mentioned, we have to activate the demand element of the ecosystem. So now with the PENCOM trying to implement the rule that workers can now assess their pension, they can assess a certain percentage of their pension as contribution of their counterpart fund to their own home ownership costs. That will really help the sector. But I think overall, just to answer specifically, to properly activate the whole of that sector, there are some institutional, I don't want to use the word blockages, which we still have to deal with, which a lot of states are happily working very hard, to deal with now. Issues around titling, you have mentioned the issue of infrastructure. Today, your project, your primary infrastructure, as a percentage of your project cost, could be as high as 10-15%, and that doesn't work, So with a lot of attention being paid to the issue of infrastructure, I am hoping that the Infraco PLC, which the CBN is talking about, which is supposed to be a 1.5 trillion naira institution, comes on board and really focuses on delivering infrastructure, because all this will help to drive costs and, of course, affordability for housing and the other segments. I do think that in the commercial space, that there probably will be some challenges in the grade A office environment, because even office the pandemic, with the volume of office that was being turned out, by last year 80,000 units was going to be 80,000 square meters of office space are going to be turned out, and by the time Famfa Oil is completed, I understand Famfa Oil is bringing 55,000 square meters into the same space. With a struggling economy, the question is, where are the tenants? So I think that I agree with Ifema that we also need to begin to look at other sweet spots. She has mentioned warehousing and logistics. I also think healthcare is going to be a very big area for focus going into the future. If you're able to access the right sort of funding for it, and those are the kind of things that we are looking at in my company at the moment. Thank you. Back to you.
Thanks, Hakeem. I think there's some questions came in from the audience. and I think you've touched on most of it there in terms of, the question was focused around the residential space, and I think we've done that. We've covered that. So thanks very much for that feedback. On the last point that you raised in terms of governments that are still in process, I think what will be interesting, and I'd like anyone to please feel free to take a stab. But I think what's also important, it's how do we as developers and financiers begin to build more resilience within the existing asset class. Because clearly retail is here to stay. Would it evolve? Would there be changing themes? Yes. Whilst this creates an opportunity for new asset classes to emerge, but it's also important that existing assets, we build the right resilience into them, and also for the future pipeline, be able to ensure that the lessons from COVID or any other issue is then implemented. So I think it'll be useful to get perspectives on just creating that resilience within the asset class. Real estate is long term. We're dealing with COVID. COVID is short term. That's whether it's 1 year or 2 years, that's short term to the life of any real estate asset class. So how do we ride this curve, and how do we create resilience?
So if I may jump in at this point to talk from the financial side.
Yes, thank you.
I have a few points, but I'll just focus on maybe one or two brief points. I think one way, I've forgotten who touched upon it already. Anyway, one way we can build resilience is how we structure the capital of these companies that are investing in real estate. Prior to the crisis, the previous crisis, right, there was this excessive leverage being put on the balance sheets. And now I think developers are beginning to realize that the sector could be volatile, and sometimes you need a buffer for the bad times. So it's reducing the amount of leverage on each asset, on the asset classes. And for an institution like IFC, there was a time we would invest where leverage was above 50%. Now we look at projects below 50%, maybe between 40 and 35%. Even if the numbers work at 50%, 60% leverage, that's the base case. We have discovered that there are just constant crises that erupt. So the balance sheets need to be more stable. A second one, which I'll mention before I pass on to the other speakers so I don't take too much of the time, is there was a time we believed that the dollar-linked rent was an effective hedge when a company is borrowing in dollars, right? And I know David mentioned that for the office buildings that you have, that it's only about 4% of revenue that's turnover. So it's 4% of turnover that's rental payments. So as a result, they're not really too affected by the fact that it's dollar rent. But when you come to places like retail, some other sectors, commercial, shopping malls and so on, what we find is that beyond a certain threshold, the tenants will not absorb the devaluation. So it's not foolproof to say that I can take this amount of debt because this, and in dollars, because this rent is guaranteed. And what we find is that sometimes the pushback on the rent is structured synthetically. We are told that they're still paying dollar rent, but the exchange rate is frozen. So that means you have effectively devalued. And another one is maybe they get concessions, 3 months of rent free, this and that. So effectively, it's not foolproof. Yes, it's a good in-between solution, but it is not the solution. So that lower leverage is still important, even when you get dollar-linked rent. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay,
I think.
I don't know. Okay.
Can I jump in?
Yes, go on.
David, I've got to on you, so please carry on.
Thank you. So I think Okay. To have a sustainable industry, number one, you need good sources of equity funding. Number two, you need good sources of debt funding. And number three is you need tenants who trust developers and bankers. Okay, so go through all three. It's a chicken and an egg, but to go through all of them, we've talked a lot about equity funding. So there's development funds like ourselves. We've got 205 million of committed capital. We've only committed 20% of that. So we've got $160 million of equity that we are is currently available to finance projects in Africa. Also on the equity side, you've got REITs as off-takers. That means that development funds like ourselves can exit in time and then go on and recycle that capital for more projects. We're seeing right now MES funding coming in because your equity funders can't get to countries. So the MES funders are happy to step in for 5 or 6 months and actually finance projects. So that's really your equity box ticked. On the debt side, we do need the banks because it makes projects cheaper. So yes, if your point on the level of debt is very well made, and I completely agree, but it does make projects more affordable for tenants. And then the third one is very, very important, which is tenants, because without the tenants, you're not going to get your debt funding and you're not going to get your equity funding. So you need to have a good tenant covenant, a tenant who trusts your developer. I think we're very, very lucky in that we've got an in-house developer, Eris Property Group, who's delivered all of our projects, and they've done 120 projects across Africa. So we feel very comfortable that if a tenant commits to us, we are able to deliver that project on time and on budget. So it's all about the whole package for your tenants. From the start, Eris as standard will deliver a white box fit out. So that's ceilings, that's floors, that's painted walls, blinds, carpets, air conditioning hooked up, lighting. That is, I think, some step away from where your standard delivery is in Africa. That makes your tenant fit out so much cheaper. So that makes our buildings much more attractive to tenants. Then you've got parking. A lot of these buildings are underparked. We make sure that there's adequate parking for our tenants because it is very, very stressful trying to park on the street when you're going to a meeting. We also, within our development budget, we allow a tenant installation allowance. So tenants, we can help them with their installation. Tenants who are willing to pre-commit to us, we can help them with their installation. That's a very efficient way of doing it because you can get your main contractor put in all the piping, all the during the actual construction phase instead of having to break pipes and reconnect electricity later down the line. So it's all about making it very, very easy for your tenant to do that. And I think the industry is still in its infancy there. We are seeing some tenants who are willing to pre-commit. We typically now are focusing really on bespoke head offices for larger tenants who want to take up a larger percentage of your floor space that you know that from day one, you can pay back the bank debt and you've got a sustainable business. That's really, I think, and those three things go hand in hand. We need all three of those to be firing to get a successful and sustainable real estate industry.
Okay, can I jump in, Tola? Can I jump in? Okay, I'm not sure whether Tola is. Okay, I've jumped in already. Anyway.
Am I keen?
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Please go.
I mean, I'm going
Thanks,
to
David. All right.
I'm just going to build on what Ifeoma and, of course, David also said. For me, I always stress that real estate is a financing game at the end of the day. You know, a lot of people tend to see real estate more as the brick and mortar, as the consultant, as whatever, you know, but ultimately it's a financing game because whether or not you're going to remain in the industry will depend on whether or not you're able to match your assets and liabilities optimally in the medium to long term. You know, and I always try to underscore this by what I call the 3 R's. You know, if you're going to have a successful, robust real estate sector in any economy, you have to look at the risk, you have to look at the return, you have to look at the regulation. You know, we already said so much about the return earlier in the course of this. You know, risk is also critical, regulation is also critical. Ultimately, anybody who's going to put funding into real estate project, you know, we'll be looking at those three parameters. And at the end of the day, you know, it depends on the structure of the economy. You know, a lot of the time, I sit with bankers every time. I sit with lenders, I sit with financiers, you know. But the reality of the matter is that the structure of the economy will determine what happens. When MPR is 13% and everything is priced off the back of MPR, there's very little any lender can do, you know. And in 2015, and let's remember, I mean, for Nigeria, for example, this crisis in terms of what happens between tenants and landlords, this is not the first time we're having this. As recently as 2015, Tola will remember, because his bank financed a mall that we both did together. At the time we were going to open the mall, we had 98% signed leases. Then 2015, the crisis came. We went to bed one day, we woke up the following morning, and dollar depreciated by almost 30-40%. The reality of the matter is that a lot of the tenants could not make up the difference, and we had to start giving freebies. We had to give some tenants 1 year free rent. We had to give retrofitting allowance and all those stuff, So those risks are always there. So for me, I think that in looking at it from what is happening with this pandemic, a lot of things have to reset. Government has significant role to play. We need some degree of certainty. We need some degree of regulatory proactiveness. We need to be able to create assets. Part of the challenge of the industry in Nigeria today is liquidity. Liquidity because that there's so many constraints. I always say that we have to commoditize real estate in Nigeria. We have to be able to buy real estate the same way you buy any other thing. You have to be able to buy houses and flip. But today, when you think of the regulatory bottlenecks and constraints, you just don't want to DI it, So these are some of the issues, which are not necessarily COVID-19 driven, but which have been brought to the fore again, and which we must address, But I agree with what the panelists have said. COVID-19 will mean a change of our lives. It will not mean an end to our lives, So at the end of the day, we have a life to live, So what happens now is that we need to reset our businesses properly and take those critical steps, measured, strategic steps to ensure that we're able to sustain our business after this.
Thanks very much, Akin, David. If am I done any last words on building resilience? Anything to add from a Francophone point of view?
I think it's going to be more a general comment. I think at the end of the day, it's the name of the game is going to be trust. I mean, trust will be critical to the recovery of the African economies, and in particular in the real estate sector, at least as long as there is no vaccine or treatment for COVID-19. And that was already discussed, in previous webinars, trust in local governments and institutions, that the pandemic is really under control through appropriate policy measures, trust in businesses to implement the right measures in properties. Mossadegh Bali of Azalai last week called in for a common health and safety protocol that would be applicable in all hotels across Africa. And I think to rebuild this trust, it will obviously take time, probably months after the end of the actual sanitary crisis. But I think, as mentioned by Hakeem, I think what is important now is to stabilize for business the current situation, and once again gearing for future growth.
Okay. So
thanks, Ivan.
Yeah, just to add, I think that one thing that will help build resilience, like I mentioned before, is advisory services. Like not just every developer just going and developing. We need a bit more expertise, and if you don't have it, you use advisors, providing very targeted advisory services, not generic. Then another one I think will continue to be important, I think Hakeem touched upon this in his 3 Rs, is constant dialogue with the regulators. In some sectors, it's very important to keep in touch with government because material changes to policies could just affect the industry in those areas. And I think one area that we are very particular about with that in IFC is affordable in housing, like policies, what policies can make it more conducive to implement affordable housing. Of course, we talked earlier about REITs, right? What sort of tax policies can help us be able to establish true REITs so that you can attract the right kind of capital? Because if you have a REIT that's not a true REIT, you might not be able to fully attract the pension fund industry as you want to, or insurance, etc., or foreign investments. So I think the regulators would also help a lot. And I just wanted to add one thing. In IFC, we do have a strategy which did not start with the pandemic, but is, I think, quite relevant. But before, we focused a lot more on funding projects and less on the upstream work towards building the right environment for the project. So for us, strategically in IFC, we have this upstream element to our investment group, which helps with these type of dialogue or providing advisory service or building a more conducive environment to have a sustainable investment afterwards. And this is not general upstream work. It's targeted to support specific investments. So I think I'll stop there.
All right, thanks. I think that was quite a robust debate. I really thank the panelists. You shared quite a bit, and I think we've got 10. We have a few more minutes to wrap up. I'm just trying to see if there's any additional questions coming through, and not so much at this point. But I think we've talked very key themes here. We've talked to capital structure, which is, in any asset classes, really, then debt equity, how it goes in MES, what forms, So I think as financiers, as developers, as investors, we would constantly be evolving, and we need to be innovative in the type of structures that we need to put in place. We talked on the leveraging as a standpoint. The capital stack is always important, and I know there are no bullish tendencies where in Africa we don't structure deals on 90% leverage. So the minimum start seems to be 50%. Given where the markets are now, that may need to compress further so that we can survive. After we survive and we've created value, then you can then seek to leverage the asset. We've talked about, the risk-reward framework regulation, what government needs to do, new sectors that would emerge, the need to add advisory, and I think this is useful on the part of new developers or new investors that would emerge or that are listening, that are looking to get involved in real estate, that the is formalized, it's structured, and there's a lot to really learn and to be deep. I think those are the key summary themes for me, and I think I'll leave, and David, all the panelists will have their last departing words or comments to sign off. So David, starting with you, last words, please.
Thanks very much, Tola. I think one of the key differences between today and, say, 2015 is that the markets weren't overheated going into this. And yes, COVID is bad and it is extremely tough. But in 2015, you had oil sitting at over 100, and you had a lot of big speculative jumbo project developments that were kicked off based on oil staying at that price forever. Up until recently, oil was sitting at maybe 60, 50. So it has halved, yes, but just that the property markets weren't as overheated as before. If anything, they were still in a recovery phase from 5 years ago. So I acknowledge that it is going to be slow and difficult, but I am somewhat more optimistic over the medium term that we will be able to deliver. At the moment, our focus is on our tenants, making sure that they're healthy, they've got a safe environment. Eris manages all our properties as well. We've deep cleansed them. We've got sanitizers, social distancing, all of that's in place. But longer term, we are looking to offer the whole package to tenants. We've got the funding, Eris has got development expertise, and we think there are things to do. The markets have come down even before COVID. Accra rental market probably come off 25% in the last 5 years. Lagos, the same, or actually even more. So we haven't got that further to fall. I think that rentals are stable. The projects that we're putting together now, we are modeling rentals that will be paid in 2 years' time at the same level as today. We're not expecting them to go further. Tenants are happy with that. They're committing to that. So this is good news. I think hopefully we're at a bottom. And from here, it might be a slow recovery, but I think we're hopefully going to pull out of it and it won't be further to go.
Thank you very much, David.
Okay.
No, thank you.
Okay, Tola, can I just make my...
You can go on, and Makim, I wanted to dive in too, but yes.
Sorry, I didn't hear you, Tola.
Okay, I mean, Ivan mentioned a critical point, which is the role of trust. You know, I mean, David has spoken from the angle of how they're managing their tenants. You know, I think as developers, you know, how we also manage through this serious problem era is very critical. We have to build trust in our stakeholders. We have to build trust with our contractors. We have to build trust with our off-takers. So if you have an ongoing project, and obviously because of the lockdown, demobilization, there's going to be significant delay to your delivery schedule. You know, you have to be in touch with your customers. You know, I mean, I have an ongoing project. And one of the things we have done with my chief operating officer in the past few days is to speak to all our customers across the globe. Anywhere you are, you know, we had a conference call with them, explain why the site was shut down, and what we're doing, and explain to them that we're going to be advising them of the new completion schedule. And that's very critical because I've seen very favorable responses from our customers from that singular action that we did. You know, so trust is going to be very critical. I think it makes no sense for anybody to resign to fate. You know, you have obligations. You have to live up to your obligations. You have businesses to run. You have employees to look after. You know, and I think what is also different, David also mentioned the point, is that I think the response of government at this particular time is also a lot better than 2015. So I think that, for example, in the affordable housing space in Nigeria, I think we're still going to see significant activity going on with what Family Homes Fund is doing and with all the initiatives that have been put together in the past few years. I belong to the Housing Development Advocacy Network, and we've spent a whole lot of time, you know, talking to government in terms of the kind of reforms that we need to do to drive the sector out of this current problem. You know, I mean, but trust is going to be key. You know, and we can't just overstress that point. Thank you.
Should I go?
Yes, please. And then if and then Kev can close it up. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Last comment I wanted to add is that there are trends in the real estate sector across Africa, not only in Francophone Africa, that were existing before COVID, and that could accelerate with this crisis, such as alternative working solutions or prop tech. And the message I want to pass to developers, investors, landlords is that measures must be implemented and taken into account as soon as possible to stay ahead of the curve and respond to the new requirements and be more competitive in a market which is, at least in the short term, going to be much more challenging than what we've seen in the past. And I think that's important, to be proactive, to be flexible. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So I'll be very brief because I can see we're literally out of time. But speaking for IFC, I think one thing I've said it this is probably the third time I'm saying it now. For us, we have found out that speed of reacting to our clients is most important, because it is very important for us to keep our clients solvent during this period, because this kind of pandemic, the impact could bring down an ordinarily good client. If you're not fast enough, if they come down, there'll be jobs be lost and to have a severe economic impact. So within IFC, we're working on the speed aspect of things. We're always there to help, but this time we realize speed is the most important thing, and we have learned this from other crises. Thank you.
Thank you very much, panelists. Very useful discussion. Thanks for all your thoughts and comments. It was good having this conversation. I'll pass it on to Kev to close out the session. Thanks so much, Kev.
Thank you, Tola, and thank you to the panel, David, Ivan, Ifeoma, Hakeem. Yeah, that was great. So thank you for your insights. And thank you to the audience for your participation in the polls and questions. I hope we've covered as much as we can. We'll share the webinar video as well as all the results to the poll in a follow-up email. And on that note, yeah, next week we'll be hosting a session around the role of DFIs and financial institutions in the post-COVID recovery. That will conclude our COVID-19 Impact on African Real Estate series, which we've been running for the last couple of months. And then what we'll do is we'll introduce a whole vast new array of series and different sessions in the upcoming months, as well as an update on our events as well for the rest of the year. So once again, thank you to the audience. Tola, thanks for the presentation and moderating. Thank you to the panel, and we'll see everyone next week. Thank you.
Right. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.